So again, at the beginning of class, I gave everyone in here a folder, or the flash drive with a folder on it that said Button Fun 2. And asked everybody to take that Button Fun 2 folder, copy it to your desktop, and now double click on it and open the Xcode project file. That's the file that they build for the first 20 or so pages of this chapter. All right? Not only that, once we get into auto layout, just so you know, there's not only one way of doing it, there's not only two ways of doing it. Many times there's 3, 4, or 5 ways of doing the same thing. All right? And what I'll suggest, I'll show you a couple of them, but what I'll suggest is that you just practice with it on your own. I've been looking at the documentation. Again, as always, some of the best documentation that you find out there are people who have put stuff out on Stack Overflow, asking questions, answering questions, etc. All right? So what they mention here is the first app was fine, but there was no interactivity in it, so it's time to bring in some interactivity. I think I showed you this the other day. You may or may not be able to tell by looking at it, but if you look up on the screen here, a couple things. If you press left, that says left button pressed. If you press right, that says right button pressed. Nothing new there. We talked about this a little bit. You may or may not be able to tell the word right and the word left in there are bolded. So they go in there and they talk to you a little bit about how you can use some string attributes and some of the stuff in there. So that's discussed also. All right. What you have, just so you know, on that program, you don't have to, but if you ran it right now, what's going to happen is you're going to see the left, and if you click that, it's going to say left button pressed. But the left is going to be pretty much where it is, and where it says left button pressed, that's going to be pushed over. And you won't even see where it says right. We're going to try to fix that during class today. That's going to be the attempt. All right? And then by Thursday, I'm going to attempt to take the same stuff that we're going to go over today and apply that towards my version of that button guess game and see if we can have that done also. And I'll give you that. All right? Okay, so just like I said, just following, that's what they want us to build here. Then they go in and they talk a lot about model view controller. I've talked about it a little bit. I don't want us to get off on too big a tangent, so I'm not going to say anything more about it. Feel free to read that, and there's plenty of really, really, really good resources out there on model view controller. The bottom line is virtually everything you do here in Swift is based on a model view controller type. All right? So I had already created Button Fun, so the one that you have is called Button Fun 2 because I'd already created Button Fun. All right? And I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that might trip you up because certain things trip me up in here. All right? And hopefully, at least, you can learn some from my mistakes. All right? Ideally, that's what's going to happen. So they ask you to come in here and do this. And this is on this project, they actually do tell you to make it universal because the idea is when we're all done, you should be able to run it on anything. And it should look pretty much the same. All right? All right, then they talk about the view controller. And again, as I've already mentioned, some of this stuff that's in here, we've already talked about. Okay? A couple people today, Laura in particular, and it happened to me also, so I'm not picking on anybody. But I've already had situations where I create my Swift file. So I've got my view controller and I've got my app delegate. We're going to look at app delegate by the end of class today. All right? But literally, as she did, all I did was build my interface. Then just to see how it looked, I went and saved it and ran it. And when it started to run, boom, I hadn't even wired up anything yet. I hadn't done anything. And basically, it just stopped. It crapped out, pardon my French, and it pointed me to app delegate file, not Swift. And I don't know what I did because there wasn't anything I'd even wired up yet to break, so to speak. All I'd done was throw a few controls out there, all right? And I tried it a couple times where I removed the controls and ran it, and then it ran, but there was nothing there. Then I put the controls back again, and it broke again. All right? Then I went and said, fine. So I started up a new project, did the exact same thing, and then it worked. I don't know enough about this that I can explain why that would happen. All right? Doug would say FM, you know, flamin' magic type of thing, but I don't know. All right, sometimes stuff just happens. All right, then as they get through here, they say that when you first, and this should be familiar to everybody now, when you first start up a project, this is what you get. And in fact, what the author says here is, we're not even going to use either one of these. So one of the first things that he has you do there is he has you just remove both the view did load and the did receive memory warning. Okay? All right. After that, he talks about outlets and actions. We've done this already. We've talked about it. He does a much better and more thorough job, and probably more authoritative job than I do explaining this. If you know, let's just make it as simple as possible. If you make something an outlet, it's going to be a variable. If you make something an action, it's going to be a method. Does that make sense to people? All right. And there's certain things like I can't think of a reason you would ever want to make a method out of a label. Now, you know, you might be able to come up and tell me one. I want to click, I want to do this, whatever. That's fine. All right, but most of the time, it's going to be set up where, again, your actions are going to be for your methods, and just a regular outlet is going to be for a label. So I think we've talked about this already, and I just want to, one more time, all right, the very bottom of this page here, the bottom of page 56 and going on to the next page, the author talks about this using this question mark and using this exclamation point. You're going to see this in this program. All right? One thing about Swift is Swift does not want to let itself ever be compromised. It doesn't ever want to put itself into a situation where it could be kind of, for lack of better words, in purgatory. All right? So it doesn't allow that to happen. All right? That's why you may have noticed that normally when you set up when you set up a variable, it's going to look like this. You don't put that exclamation point that you see right there. You don't put it there. It gets put there for you. And it all has to do with how this stuff is set up, what happens behind the scenes. That's what's mentioned on the bottom of the previous page and the top of this page. All right? But what we're doing right there is we're basically saying to the system, don't worry about it. I know it's not initialized yet, but since that's there, by the time you run the program, there'll be a value in there. All right? So the good news is putting that kind of thing in there makes it work. The bad news is if you don't give it a value, when you run the program, when it's expecting the value, the program blows up. Does that make sense to people? But it's a necessary evil. You have to basically put it in like this. And it all goes into, they talk about being with unwrapping. What you're doing basically when you take something and you use it with the exclamation point is you're saying it's an optional. That's literally what it's saying, is it's an optional variable. All right? But by putting it there, yeah, it's an optional, but what this says is it's optional, but it'll be unwrapped when the program runs and it needs it. In other words, there will be a value there. All right? That's what it's saying. All right, and if that doesn't make sense, I don't know any other way to explain it. If you don't like my explanation, I'd suggest that you go and Google, all right, just literally go in there and Google optionally unwrapped variables or implicitly unwrapped variables in Swift and take a look, because I'm sure it's going to push you out the Stack Overflow, probably. And there'll probably be something out there that's done and explained better than I just explained it. All right? All right, we talked about the actions already. So again, none of that stuff is new. All right, and I do want to make sure that people understand a couple things. When you look up on the screen here, there's actually, as it says, there's 3 ways that you can set up a function. All right, when you declare an action. And literally, it can say this, where it says IB action func do something, sender, and then something like that. Or it says something like this, or it says nothing at all. You may or may not remember when we wired that button up, I did quickly press the down arrow. All right? It said sender. So in other words, when we wired the button up and it had all that stuff in a little box, the last one said sender. All right? And there were also 2 other choices in there. One that said none, which would remove everything, and the other one said sender and event. And what they're saying is some of the stuff that's here is a throwback. You've got to remember this language is well over 10 years old. I don't mean Swift, all right? I mean Objective-C, which is a lot of this is based off of. So you're going to see stuff out there, and the author even mentions it. Well, you might see something out there on occasion where don't even worry about it because there might be something out there. You're not going to use it, but you need it out there for the program to compile. So that's when he has you next come in there on page 58 and clean up the view controller by getting rid of it. Then he has you start to design the interface. So you come in here and you add, he wants you to basically come in and add the buttons. I'm taking for granted by now that people have a comfort level that you know where the assistant editor is. Remember, it doesn't look like that anymore. Instead, the assistant editor now kind of looks like this, all right, like that, all right. That you know how this will turn on and off different things. This will turn on and off the project navigator, on and off your console, bless you, on and off your object area, all right, bless you. And I'm taking for granted that that stuff makes sense to people. Again, if it doesn't, play with it. That's the only way to make it make sense. And the stuff that's down here, all right? I mean, like that one's the attributes inspector. That's the file inspector. I don't remember what they all are, and I use them as I need them, type of an idea. Is everybody okay now, for lack of better words? I know okay isn't the greatest of words, with wiring stuff up. So you create your button, you hold down on the control key, and you drag up there. Does that make sense to people? All right. And again, Swift does not care. You can literally put your methods first, and then you can put your variables. It's convention that you put the variables first, and that's a holdover from C, with the way that C programs, some of them at least, had to be written. And many other languages, too, expect you to put your variables first, then your methods. I think that's the best way to do it. As far as if you've got a bunch of Swift methods, you can put yours above those, below those. You can intersperse them any way you want. That really and truly doesn't matter one way or the other. So again, they have you come in here, and this is the one thing that we had talked about before. All right, so you've got your outlet type, UI button, etc. You give it a name. So this is all the stuff that we talked about before. But notice that when you change this from outlet right here, and you change it, now I thought it was on here, maybe it's not. When you change it to action, all right, so when you change it from outlet to action, this is what I mentioned before. Well, when that says outlet, it looks like you see on the top of page 63. Changing it to action, all right, and giving it a name, this is where we talked about this before, and some of you have talked to me about this individually. If you leave that set to any object, the program will still work. You won't see any noticeable difference. What that means by leaving it set to any object is anything on your screen can call this routine. By changing it to UI button, which is what the author asks you to do, that means that the only buttons can call this routine. So you're putting in a little bit of validity checking. It's not a lot, but it's a little bit. This is the touch up inside. If you've never clicked the down arrow here, you should, because it'll show you approximately 15 different methods that you can call that are associated with buttons. Just like in Android, not even Android, I should say, more or less like in working with Visual Studio. I would say literally 100% of the time, you create a button in Visual Studio, you double click on it, you bring up its click routine, and that's where you'd write the code. But there are a whole bunch of other methods that you can conceivably add code to. Most of the time you don't. In much the same way, most of the time you're going to be using touch up inside. And literally what that means is you push down on a button, you're still in that button area, and now you're lifting up. That's literally what it means. All right? And this is where I mentioned this to you before, that if you click the down arrow right there, it's going to say none, sender, and sender in event. Here's where they explain that any object, I'm not going to go over it, I already did. And the different things in there with a touch up inside, etc. Okay? So he has you put in a button, then put in another button. And he has you wire up that second button. But remember, the key thing with the second one is we want to use the same event handler, the one we've already created. All right? So we want to use that same one for both. All right? Now, I want to mention this because, again, I was talking with somebody else in here today about this, but I don't like the way that he calls this button pressed. I think that's a very generic name. There should be something in there because who knows, later you might come in and you might decide you want to expand the interface for whatever reason. All right? Even in there, button pressed, I mean, I guess you can make the case, well, it's either left or it's right. All right? But I still think you could have come up with a better name. But the point is, in this case, we've already made our left button. Now we've got our right one, and we're wiring it up. We don't want to create a brand new method. We could have literally called this one left button pressed and make another one that says right button pressed. They would have been identical methods. Literally, they would have been identical methods. All right? But then, rather than having to put in that one line of code that grabs the title, the left or the right, you could then hard code in there left or right. There's really no sense in doing that. So what the author showed you here is by lifting up, you should see that where it turns gray, all right? And as soon as you click off of it or just let go, it's now both the left button and the right button are wired up to the button pressed routine. And unless somebody has a question and stops me, I'm just going to keep on going. He comes in and he talks about the different stuff in the label. Again, when you go into the attributes inspector, I hope I'm right here in expecting that all the stuff that's in here, by and large, that you need to work with so far, color, alignment, etc., that all makes sense to you. All right, and again, the easiest way to find out how to use this stuff is to play with it. You may have noticed this already, that if you go to color, and if you click in there, and you click one more time, you get the little, looks like the little box of crayons. What you may or may not have noticed, it was when you've got the little box of crayons, there also is at least one other button that's up in the upper left-hand corner. There might be two. There's different ways that you can set colors. All right? And it's also, although I've done very little of it with this, you can use the equivalent of RGB, etc. Okay? And when you start to go in and you start working with this stuff, and it may be here, it may be someplace else, I don't remember. But there also is a way that you can go in there and you can work with the alpha. All right. Remember, 0 meaning that it's going to be totally transparent, and 1 meaning it's going to be totally opaque. Okay, and you put a number in there between 0 and 1. Kind of an important point here, just so you see this. All right, I'm going to see if I can bring this up. Where is it? Main storyboard. So if you look right here, if you look at the GUI, so to speak, there's the left button, there's the right button, okay? But what I want to show you is this. See that? That's the label that they told you to make up at the top, all right? And if you look on the middle bottom, so to speak, of page 67, here the author says, note, if you have invisible user interface elements like empty labels, and want to be able to see where they are, you go up to the editor up on the top of your screen, click that, and underneath that there's Canvas. And underneath that, if you go over to the right, there's a bunch of drop downs. And if you choose Show Bounds Rectangles, that makes that. It's a checkbox. So if I go and uncheck that right now, all that'll happen is you won't be able to tell it's there. You can still click on it. But a lot of people like to leave this, especially if you've got a lot of labels or a lot of other controls that aren't going to show until runtime. All right, then on the bottom of page 67, the author says, well, all that's left is to wire up the label. And he says, we do this the way we did it before, except again, this time when we do it, we're going to set it up and we're going to make it an outlet rather than an action. Okay? So, as we look right here, and this is perfect to have this up, what the author is saying is at this point in the program, and I know it doesn't show real well on here, but imagine for a second, because I already put that code in, but imagine that code that's here wasn't there. When you get to the point where we are right here, you should have the import UI kit, the class view controller, which again extends or inherits from UI view controller. What we'll talk about later, you can change that name. Okay, you can change that name. That said, don't manually go in and change the name. It won't work right. You'll screw up every intermediate file if you do that. All right, you've got to go in and basically in one of the inspectors up here, you got to go in and make some changes there and tell it because it's expecting, unless told otherwise, it's expecting it to be called view controller. All right, but in here, for instance, if we wanted to change this to left-right button view controller, we can do it. We're just not going to go through that right now. All right, so we've done that. We've created this. And again, when we created this right here, when we created that, all right, it automatically put the exclamation point in for us. Then we're going to put the code in here. Let's take a look at the code. Originally, all they want you to put in here, let's see, are these 3 lines. Okay, originally it's just these 3 lines. So let's forget about these lines here, lines 21 through 27. Let's forget about those for just a second. All right, and we'll just concentrate on the 3 lines that are there. The first one says let title equal sender dot title for state and then in parentheses dot normal with an exclamation point on the end. Let me tell you, when I first did this, I couldn't understand it, and it made total sense when I walked away from it for a minute. When I ran it and instead of having it say left button pressed or right button pressed, when I ran the program, it said optional, then in parentheses it said left, parentheses, button pressed, or optional, parentheses, right, parentheses, button pressed. Why did it do that? No. It had the word optional because when I set up the title, I did not put the exclamation point there. Since it's an optional variable, it was letting me know it was optional. So I didn't get the right output. So I screwed up, but it was a good screw up because it showed me something I would not have I'm sure would have come across it sooner or later anyway. All right, so we're setting the title here. So basically, what it's saying is when we're in a normal state, when we're not doing anything special, okay, then what we're saying is when that happens and we click it, we want it to remember this syntax, it's right here on line 18. Backslash, then in parentheses, the name of the variable. That's interpolation. That says when you run this, get rid of that and replace it with the actual value of title, which will either be left or right. So that gives you the left button pressed or the right button pressed. And we're saying we want it formatted as plain text. That probably would work without even that line in there because that's what it should default to anyway. And really, just plain text means just that. No bold, no italicizing, no underlining, no nothing. All right? So if you need more on that, on the bottom of page 69 and on page 70, the author explains what I just went over. Again, I'm not gonna sit and read to you. All right? So I just want to show you this. I'm going to move up here because now we're basically just about where I wanted us to be. There's more on automatic reference counting here on page 69. Some good stuff. These guys get it. All right? I have a hard time believing this book is as new as it is and it's out there on ITE books. I still don't know what that relationship is, you know, as far as if what we're doing is exactly well, I'd say kosher, you know, after what we were talking about before or not, but. And it may not mean anything to you. We didn't do a lot of it. We did a little bit more of it last semester, and I totally lost half the class. When you are working in C, not Objective-C, not in Swift, if you are working in C, anytime you want to dynamically allocate memory, you use built-in C functions like malloc, that they show right here, which stands for memory allocate, and calloc. All right, I don't even want to go into them right now, but the point is, okay, the point is you then as a programmer are responsible for making sure that you call the free function later and you free that memory up. If you don't, that memory is still being used and you're never really letting go of it, okay? And especially if you've got apps that run continuously and you're constantly, you know, taking memory and allocating it and you're never freeing it up, you may run out of memory no matter how much you have. All right, or you may fragment it so much that it's really hard for, it really bogs the program down. So again, on the bottom of 69 and going on to page 70, he explains what all that stuff is. The only thing I didn't really say is this tip that's here on page 70. It's in blue right now. It says you probably noticed that the argument we used to call title for state was dot normal. All right. And let me move I got the cursor sitting there. Not UI control state dot normal. It says Swift already knows that the argument must be one of the values for UI control state, so you can omit it. If that confuses you, sometimes when people see something in parentheses like a dot normal, in English the author's saying you could have written UI control state dot normal and it would have worked also. All right? But the system knows. If you don't put it in, it basically defaults to that in this case. All right. Then the author says, let's run it. Let's try it out. This is where I was hoping, whoops, this is where I wanted us to be right now. Perfect. All right. And right now, I'm going to run my program and show you it looks pretty much like this. Okay? The only thing I want to say is when we start going over it, because I've tried doing this program several times, all right, that when the author put this button here and the other button over there, wherever it is, and the label over here, etc., he kind of used arbitrary locations. In other words, he dragged it and put it here, dragged that and he put it there, dragged that and he put it there. Does that make sense? When I put the stuff in there, I did the same thing. So the numbers that you're going to see when we start talking auto layout aren't the numbers that I have aren't going to be the same numbers that he has. All right, personally, I wouldn't let that bother me if I was you. Okay? All right. So if I come back to the program then, all right, and I'm not even sure what that one is, but I don't like the way that looks, so let's see once. Oh, we'll try running it anyway, that's fine. What you're going to see is something very similar to what's shown on page 71 in the book, just so you're aware of that. Okay, it'll look very similar to what's on page 71. In other words, you'll see the left button just fine. You'll see when you press the left button, you'll see part of where it says left button pressed, but you won't see the right button. And that's what the rest of the chapter, other than the last 3 or 4 pages, that's what it's about. All right. And I don't know about the rest of you. Again, you're all using what, MacBook Pros, I think? Is that MacBook Air? And I've got a Pro. So I've got the bigger one. And I don't know if there's any difference. I noticed that, boy, playing around with your touchpad is a hell of a lot different than playing around with my touchpad. Yours is much easier and softer to the touch, so to speak. Mine's not. All right? Maybe mine just is a hard ass like I am. I don't know. But I actually like working with those better than the one that I have. All right. I've also noticed on here, and I think I've said this to you before, sometimes like this, the simulator will come up, and I'll let it sit for a while, and it won't do anything. All right. And if I look behind it, it'll show me underneath here that I've lost my connection. And normally when I do that, if I just quit the simulator, start it up and run it again, it's okay. All right. No offense to John here, but I've had less problems with the simulator than I have with the emulator in Android. All right. So you can see right now there's left, and when I click it, now it's not, it is up here. Come on. Oh, that's the one I didn't change. So you see how it's got optional because I don't have that exclamation point there? All right. That's good. I've got 2 copies here. I guess I ran the old copy, which is fine. Except what I want to do is literally, I want to close every project I have because I have 2 of them open right now, and I don't like that. There's the other one. So this is the one that should look correct. Is this making sense? Like I said, if we just spend every period doing this, you'll probably learn the language and learn it pretty well, but you won't have any time to work on your own stuff. All right, and that's why I'm taping this, but what I'd like to do with at least some of these is do the tapes at home, and then you be able to watch them at your leisure, so to speak, and we can just go on. All right, like I said, my hope is on Thursday I can have that guessing game fixed and with some auto layout, and when I saw this thing on I don't know, with some YouTube video that I think what we're going to try next is, unless anybody has a big problem with it, is we're just trying to build a calculator in Swift. Because that's a common type of thing to do. All right? And show you some of the stuff that you can do, some of the stuff you shouldn't do. All right? And it'll give me a good chance to do that. All right? Anders was asking the other day about copying. And what's really cool, if you didn't know this, is if this is my screen here. Okay, if you remember this for our program, we have what? Left, and we have right. And then we have our label. Okay, this is maybe the most important part of the class so far, so please listen to this, okay? I don't care if you look, but please listen to this. Okay, let's pretend we didn't have this one yet, all right? So we go in and we wire this one up. So, we've got our func button pressed, or whatever the heck he said to call it. And you've got in here, you've got sender and : UI button. And I want to tell you this because you may know this, but you may not know this. All right? Now, what they tell you to do in the book is to go out back to your object library and drag another button out. Everybody cool with that? Okay. But what you may or may not know is when you've got that button right there, if you hold down on the control key and you drag out, it'll make a copy. And guess what? That copy is automatically wired up. You don't have to do anything. That's why that's kind of nice. All right? So why am I telling you that? Because when we go in and we make the calculator, we're going to make one button that has our number on it. Then we're going to copy it 9 times. Does that make sense? Because then we can have the same routine handle all of them. All right? So that's what we plan on doing soon. Yes?
Okay, if you use copy and paste like you would like in any other program,
yes.
Totally goes your project though. I copied my left button, make the right button.
Okay, what Anders said here was don't use copy and paste to do this because it'll host things up. All right? And I'm sure if we had somebody here from Apple, they'd say, well, that's because you're trying to use a Microsoft copy and paste. All right? And we're above that. All right? But I'm just telling you, if you use the control and you drag it out, you'll get like a little dashes and stuff, and it'll show you it. You can put it wherever you want. All right? I just suggest you do that. That's all. All right, we're going to take a break in a couple minutes, but before we do, there's just one last thing that I want to do, because I'm going to change the order of this up just a second, and we'll do the rest after the break. That's why I asked if I don't want to be ticking people off where it's like, oh my God, you're sitting here talking, and all I'm doing is getting more confused. Because if we're doing that, then I'm doing something wrong. All right, so I'm going to go back to here, And I'm going to jump up till right near the end of the chapter, all the way up to page 83. All right. And about halfway down, about halfway down on the page there, let's just do it this way. They start talking about the application delegate. All right. I want to mention this because, as I told you before, this is where I and I think other people have had some errors and stuff that's happened. But a delegate is just that. In other words, all right, and this has happened before, during the break, right before we had our winter break, okay? I was talking with Terry Prindle, and I don't know if you were, that was a meeting you were at or not, but we were talking, and basically what I told him was, hey, I'm not going to be around during the break, and John said he was. So what happened? John was the delegate. I'm not saying my delegate, he was the delegate. In other words, he was the one entrusted to make decisions and do things that had to be done. Well, notice what it says in here. It says, before we move on, because this is the end of the chapter, it says, let's talk about the source code file we have not examined yet. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. That source code file, automatically, when you create a project, so I create a project, hello. I'm going to get hello.swift, and I'm going to get appdelegate.swift. All right, so this is the one we haven't talked about. It says this file implements our application delegates. Cocoa Touch, which is kind of what's behind the scenes, it's not the operating system, but it's sort of what's running everything in here. As it says, it makes extensive use of delegates, which are objects that take responsibility for doing tasks on behalf of another object. All right? And what it's saying is there are things that happen that you don't have to worry about because there's already been something delegated to do that. And the author gives you an example. It says every iOS application has exactly one instance of UI application. That is responsible for the app's run loop, and it handles application level functionality. Why? So you don't have to. All right, so some of the work you don't have to do, it's been delegated off. That doesn't mean that if you know where that code is, you know, those delegates are, that you can't put your own code in there. All right, will you want to? It depends on the situation. Probably not when you're a novice at this. You're probably not going to be wanting to go digging your fingers in there and doing stuff you probably shouldn't do. All right. So the author says here, I'm down towards the bottom of the page now on page 83. Again, at certain well-defined times, UI application will call specific methods on its delegate. If the delegate exists and it implements this method. For example, it says you have code that needs to fire just before your program quits. You would implement the method application will terminate. Why would you want to do that? Very similar to one of the first things I teach people, and people in the C# class, and Teresa's one of the ones in there, know this. One of the first things I showed people was that if you click the exit button, rather than just closing it, you should ask first, are you sure you want to do this? Well, what you might want to put under application will terminate, you might want to ask the user, do they want to terminate? And if you don't want to give them any choice, if you've got a database connection open, you might want to make sure it's closed. You might want to make sure files are closed. Any kind of housekeeping is taken care of. Now, most of the time, if you forget to do that, it'll be done for you anyway, but it's still considered a better way to go. All right. So the last sentence on that page says, all of the Xcode templates create an application delegate for you and arrange for it to be linked to the UI application object when the app launches. So what I'm going to do is just switch back in here into Xcode. Oops, not there. Give me a break. I don't know why it... Okay, I'll have to reopen it. No, there it is. Okay, good. All right. So turning up to page 84, what the author says here is they say click the appdelegate.swift. All right, so let's click it. All right, so there's the appdelegate.swift right there. In fact, probably we don't need much of anything else opened here. So I can close that. That'll give me plenty of room. All right. Which brought me back to here. So we want to be there. All right. All right. And the author says right near the top, it says class app delegate, UI responder, comma, UI application delegate, which looks a little bit confusing. You're like, wait a minute, we only have single inheritance here. All right. So the author says the UI application delegate says that this class conforms to what's called a protocol that's called UI delegate. All right. So notice, if I take my mouse, put it here, and hold down, I'm on my Option key. Everybody see that? Everybody see what just happened? I'm going to hold down on my Option key, and I'm going to take my mouse, and I can put it over things. And I get that question mark. All right? And it's a way that I can open up stuff in there and find out all sorts of information. All right, and before we go on, I want you to realize how important this is. If you are working in a really big application that maybe you're working on with scores of other people and you've got a variable, I don't care what the variable is. You come across this variable, and because somebody else created it, they used a terrible naming structure, and it said it's called X. Everybody with me? It's just called X. You can do this kind of thing where you hold down on the Option key and you can put it over your variable, and it'll tell you whether it's a constant or a variable and the type of variable it is, which is just nice because you can find out stuff that way. So again, I did the control, and notice what it has. It's basically bringing up the equivalent of some online help. It's got the declaration, a description, I'm not going to read any of that, the availability, where it's declared in, and I can't even read that. But the point is, the last two things on the page there, notice they're hyperlinked. So if I go over here to UI Kit and I click, it's going to bring up more information for me sooner or later. All right? But it'll bring up stuff, and I may not have even done it right, but I thought I did. All right? But what they mention in your book here on 83, 84, 85, and 86 is how you can navigate your way around in here. All right? And that's all I wanted to say was just that you can navigate your way around in here. All right? So it's 3:53, at least on my clock here. Let's come back at 4:05, please.